Hello, check. Hello. Welcome to DECODE IAS. Well, if you're expecting another coaching lecture or another marathon class or rather a PowerPoint presentation, then this channel probably is not for you, because this is not a classroom. It is going to be an audio library, a place where you can understand India while traveling or while walking or even while driving, or even simply by closing your eyes and just listen. Listen to the stories. Every episode on this channel is designed like a documentary which is well researched like a policy paper and explained like a conversation, like a story, like raising certain questions which are often asked, which are expected from an aspirant. Here we won't just memorize facts for an examination. We will try to answer bigger questions. Why did India become the country it is today? Why do our institutions function the way they do? Why do some policies succeed while others fail? Why do the same debate keeps returning generations after generations? Well, whether you are preparing for UPSC or for that matter any other competitive examination, you are simply curious about how India works. I hope these conversations make you think a little deeper. So wherever you are listening from, thank you for giving me your time. Let's begin. This is the first season of DECODE IAS. Here we will discuss the stories of how the birth of modern India happened. A story about the extraordinary years that shaped the nation we live in today. And in this very episode, we begin with one of the biggest questions in modern Indian history. And the question is, why did Britain suddenly left India? Well, let us understand as why did the British suddenly leave India in 1947. On 20th of February 1947, inside the House of Commons in London, the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee stood up. He stood up and made an announcement that shocked even his own viceroy sitting in Delhi. He declared that Britain would transfer power to India, and the deadline was before June 1948. Whether Indian leaders agreed on how the country would be divided or not, it wasn't the matter. It wasn't even considered. Even Gandhi had no idea that this announcement was coming. Nehru didn't know, and Jinnah didn't know either. An empire that ruled India for nearly 200 years, an empire that had never shown any intention of leaving India, was suddenly announcing its own exit. The question is, why so suddenly? Why so quickly? Well, almost all of us, including the Western countries, we have been growing up, and most of us were taught a fairly simple story. A simple story about India's independence struggle. We have been focused that Mahatma Gandhi's non-violent movement, his civil disobedience movement, his different non-violent campaigns, and even the Quit India movement of 1942. Well, these were the reasons why the Britishers finally left India. But trust me, this is not the whole truth. Because none of these movements were new. Gandhi had been leading India's freedom struggle since 1915, more than 2 decades before independence. Even the Quit India movement took place in 1942, 5 years before India became independent. And the British actually crushed that movement, the movement which we are very proud of. It's the Quit India movement. Britishers actually crushed that movement with an extraordinary force. Almost overnight, the entire top leadership of the Indian National Congress was arrested and imprisoned. So here's the obvious question. If these movements alone forced Britain out, then why didn't Britain leave India in 1942? What changed dramatically between 1945 to 1947 that an empire which ruled India for nearly 2 centuries suddenly rushed for its exit? The answer is not one single event, my friend. It is a collision of 4 powerful forces, all unfolding at exactly the same time. And today we will examine those forces through declassified, I repeat, through declassified British cabinet papers, the official transfer of power documents, and the work of historians who have spent decades studying the archives on both sides. The first reason is not the most emotional one, but trust me, it may be very well have been the most decisive one for sure. Well, in 1945, you must be aware that the Second World War finally came to an end. Britain had technically won the war, but the victory came at an enormous cost. Behind the celebration, Britain was financially exhausted. During the war, Britain had borrowed so heavily that its total debt has reached to roughly 3.5 billion pounds. And here is the remarkable part. Nearly 1/3 of that money was actually owed to India. Think about that for a moment. For centuries, Britain had extracted wealth from India, and now the colonial relationship have actually turned upside down. Britain had been indebted to its own colony. The financial crisis didn't even stop there. To prevent its economy from collapsing, the Britain had to take an emergency loan of around $3.75 billion from the United States. And soon after, it became one of the largest beneficiaries of the Marshall Plan. Even years after the war had ended, rationing was still in place across Britain. But this wasn't just about money. More than 2.5 million Indian soldiers had fought for the Britain during the war. Indian industries, its food, factories, its raw materials, all have been redirected towards Britain's war effort. One of the most devastating consequences of this diversion was the Great Bengal Famine of 1943, where an estimated 2 to 3 million people died from starvation. It was a tragedy that permanently damaged Britain's moral credibility, a tragedy that damaged its image and raised serious questions about both its priorities and its ability to govern. Now just think about for a moment. Ask yourself, how can a country who is struggling to feed its own people, a country dependent on foreign loans, continue to control a subcontinent of 400 million people nearly 8,000 kilometers away? Is it possible or feasible? Well, the empire aren't held together by flags. They were held together by money, my friend. Money that pays the soldier, money that runs the bureaucracy, money funds the police, and when the treasury runs dry, so does the empire. Let me quickly move on to the second reason, which is even more dramatic, because it struck at the very foundation of the British rule. Well, you see, everything the British Empire controlled in India ultimately depended on one thing. It depended on one thing, and that was the loyalty of the Indian soldiers. Without them, the entire empire simply couldn't function. And then came November 1945. Inside the Delhi's Red Fort, 3 officers of the Indian National Army, Shahnawaz Khan, Prem Sehgal, and Gurbaksh Singh Dhillon, all were put on trial for treason. These men had fought alongside Subhash Chandra Bose against the British during the Second World War. Well, the British officials believed that this trial would send a very strong and powerful message, but instead, it achieved the exact opposite. Across India, be it Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, people from different communities poured into the streets in protest. For one brief moment, the political and the religious division seemed to disappear. The nation united behind the Indian National Army. And then came February 1946, a chapter of history that remains astonishingly underappreciated. It began aboard a naval ship in Bombay called HMIS Talwar. Indian sailors mutinied. Initially, they protested on the grounds of poor food, racial discrimination, and abusive treatment, but within days, the revolt spread with astonishing speed. 78 ships, 78 ships, 20 shows establishment, nearly 20,000 sailors from Bombay to Karachi to Calcutta. On many ships, something extraordinary happened. The flags of the Indian National Congress, the Muslim League, and the Communist Party all were raised together. A powerful symbol that this was no longer about one political party, it had become something larger, something much larger. For the British commanders, well, this was terrifying, because the entire empire rested on one assumption, and the assumption was that the Indian soldiers would always obey the British officers. But what happened when they stop, when the very military that keeps the empire alive begins to question its own loyalty? Well, some historians, including R.C. Majumdar, have argued that the Indian Royal Navy mutiny frightened Britain more than any previous political movement. Not every historian agrees to that conclusion, but that's okay. But there is a broad agreement on one point, that after the mutiny, the British planners privately began asking questions to themselves, asking questions that they had never seriously considered before. And the question was, my friend, can we still rely on our own armed forces to govern India? That was the question. The third reason was not inside India at all. It was happening across the world. Well, by the end of the Second World War, the global balance of power had completely changed. Completely. The British Empire had emerged victorious, but it was no longer the world's dominant power. That position now belonged to United States. And unlike the old European empires, America increasingly presented itself as a champion of self-determination, partly out of principle and partly because an end to colonial empires also meant new markets for American trade and influence. It was a win-win situation for America. During the post-war loans negotiations, Even then, the Washington repeatedly pressurized Britain to move towards decolonization. At the same time, a new international institution had just been created that was none other than the United Nations. For the first time in the modern history, the idea that people had the right to govern themselves wasn't just a political slogan. It was becoming an accepted international principle. Britain now faced an uncomfortable contradictions. Only months earlier, it had fought the deadliest war in human history in the name of freedom, well, in the name of democracy and liberation from tyranny. How could on earth it can now justify denying those very principles and ideas to nearly 400 million people in India? That contradiction was becoming impossible to defend. But change wasn't coming only from abroad. Britain itself was changing. In the general elections of 1945, Winston Churchill, the man who had fiercely opposed Indian independence, was voted out of his office. His place was taken by Clement Attlee of the Labour Party. Unlike Churchill, Attlee believed that maintaining an empire at any cost was neither economically realistic and not politically sustainable. Britain hadn't simply changed governments. It had entered an entirely new era. An era in which holding on to colonies was becoming increasingly expensive, increasingly unpopular, and increasingly impossible. But before I begin with the fourth issue, I would like you to ponder on these points which we just discussed and think about it. Let's jump into the fourth act. The fourth act when the politics collapsed. But international pressure alone doesn't explain as to why Britain left so quickly. So the final push that came was from within, from inside India. By 1946, the political system was falling apart. It was one last attempt to preserve a united India, and for that, the British government sent what is known as the Cabinet Mission. Its goal was ambitious. The goal was find a constitutional arrangement that both the Congress and the Muslim League could accept. For several months, negotiations continued. There was still hope that India might remain one country. But the trust between the two sides, that is Congress and the Muslim League, had almost completely disappeared. Even when they appeared to agree, they interpreted the agreement in an entirely different ways. And eventually, the cabinet mission collapsed. The last realistic chance of keeping India united had actually failed. And then came one of the darkest turning points of the Indian history pre-independence. It was 16th August 1946 when the Muslim League called for Direct Action Day. It was called by Jinnah. To the press, they demanded for Pakistan. And after that announcement, after that demand, declaration, within hours, Calcutta descended into a horrific communal violence. Trust me or not, but thousands of people were killed. Hindus, Muslims, ordinary civilians, the entire neighborhoods were engulfed by hatred. The violence soon spread beyond Calcutta to other parts of the subcontinent. It's important to understand this carefully. This wasn't the fault of a single community. It was a result of years of political breakdown, deepening the mistrust, the colonial administrative policies that had often reinforced the communal divisions, and the society pushed to a breaking point. The British administration now faced a nightmare. The communal violence was escalating. Political negotiations had collapsed. Its finances had exhausted. Its military loyalty could no longer be taken for granted. Every possible solution was becoming more and more dangerous than the last. And then everything accelerated on 20th of February 1947 when Clement Attlee announced that Britain would transfer power to India no later than June 1948. It seemed very clear. It seemed like a clear timetable. But only weeks later, a new viceroy arrived in India. A new viceroy arrived Delhi. It was Lord Mountbatten. And almost immediately, he made a decision that would change history. Instead of June 1948, the deadline was brought forward to 15th August 1947. 10 months earlier. 10 months. Do you know why? Why he did this? Why he opted for this? Well, historians still debate the answer. Some argue that Mountbatten believed a faster transfer of power would reduce the uncertainty and prevent even greater violence, while others believed that he dramatically underestimated how catastrophic a rushed partition would become. Whatever his reasoning was, the consequences were enormous, and perhaps nothing symbolizes that haste more than one name: Sir Cyril Ratcliffe, a British lawyer. This is the irony, my friend. He was a British lawyer, a man who had never visited India before, a man with virtually no idea, no experience of India's geography, its politics, or its communities. And he was given the enormous and most consequential tasks in modern history. to draw borders of Punjab and Bengal, not in a year, not in several months, but in just 5 weeks. You heard it right, just 5 weeks. To draw a line that would reshape the lives of millions. According to later accounts, Ratcliffe was so disturbed by the consequences of his work that he refused his payment and destroyed his papers, and never returned to India again. By the time the borders was officially announced, between 10 to 15 million people had already begun fleeing their homes. Many didn't even now. Many didn't even know which country they belonged to. Families traveled on foot, by train, or by bullock carts, carrying only what they could hold, leaving everything else. Now we come to the most difficult question of the story. The difficult question was, what is the price that we paid for independence, for freedom? It's a human cost, my friend. To this day, historians still debate exactly how many people died during the partition of India. Some estimates were as low as 2 lakh, and others suggested the number may have reached 20 lakhs. No one knows the exact figure. And perhaps that's not the point. Because whether the true number was 200,000 or 2 million, the scale of the tragedy remains almost impossible to comprehend. It was certainly one of the largest forced migration in human history. Entire villages vanished overnight. Families that lived side by side for generations suddenly found themselves on the opposite sides of the border. That had never existed. That hadn't existed just weeks earlier. Millions abandoned their homes, their farms, their businesses, their memories, their friends. Many believed that they would return once the violence subsided, but mostly never did. Some crossed the border carrying little more than just a suitcase. This is what we got as a consequence of partition. All courtesy goes to Britain. The human losses, if anybody could be solely responsible, I believe it was the Britain policy. There are many people who are carrying their parents on their back. Many never reached their destination at all. The trains that once connected cities now carried refugees, and sometimes they arrived filled with silence. For those making the decision in London and Delhi, partition was just a political settlement, but for ordinary people, it became a personal catastrophe. When we look back at Britain's decision to leave India, it's tempting to search for one decisive cause, one turning point, or one heroic explanation. History is rarely that simple, my friend. Britain didn't leave because of a single protest, or one political leader, or a military event. It left India for almost 4 immensely powerful forces when collided at exactly the same moment. It was a bankrupt empire, a military whose loyalty could no longer be guaranteed, a world that was turning against colonialism, a political system inside India that had reached the point of collapse. And together, these forces made Britain to leave. These forces made British rule no longer sustainable. But the speed of the final withdrawal, the rushed transfer of power, and the hurried drawing of borders left behind consequences that millions of ordinary people would carry for generations. So why did the Britain suddenly leave India in 1947? Not because one man defeated an empire. Empires don't usually collapse because of one event. They collapse because of economic reality, military confidence, political stability, and international legitimacy. All begin to fail at the same time. By 1947, Britain had reached that point, my friend. The entire empire that had ruled India for nearly 2 centuries needed only 5 weeks to draw a border that would permanently alter the lives of millions. Millions. Perhaps that's the greatest irony of all. An empire that had governed India for almost 200 years spent barely a month deciding how it would leave. And the people who paid the highest price, they were ordinary men, women, children, who had no say at the negotiating table. Their future were decided in government offices, thousands of miles away. Well, if this video challenged something you thought you knew about history, let me know in the comments. Which part surprised you the most? And if you enjoy deeply researched documents like this that explores the hidden forces behind the world history, consider subscribing. Because sometimes the stories we think we know turned out to be only the beginning. Thank you so much. Until the next conversation, keep asking why.